In a gloomy crypt of the royal palace of Madrid, between silver candelabras and crimson velvet curtains, rests what they say is one of the most intimate and disturbing secrets of the European monarchy. It is not a treasure, nor a lost crown, not even the mummified heart of some holy king. It is something much more personal. According to rumors that have circulated through palace halls for more than 2 centuries, when Fernando VII of Spain died in 1833, a specific part of his anatomy was extracted and preserved in a glass jar filled with alcohol. We are not talking about his viscera or his brain, but about his male reproductive organ. This story, whispered in dark corridors and recorded in forbidden chronicles, has become one of the most bizarre and embarrassing legends in the history of European monarchy. But could it be true? Was it really the last great symbol of Spanish royal virility, preserved for posterity in a bottle like a Cobb trophy? And why, out of all the kings of Europe, was it precisely Fernando VII who ended up being remembered, not for his military conquests or political reforms, but for the supposed fate of his genitals? To understand this grotesque and fascinating story, we must dive into the life of one of the most controversial and despised monarchs in Spanish history. Fernando VII was not simply a king, he was a coward, a traitor, a tyrant, and, according to his own subjects, a man whose questionable masculinity became the perfect reflection of the decadence of an empire that had forever lost its glory. Fernando was born in 1784. Son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, in a Spain that was no longer the world power that had dominated the oceans in previous centuries. The Spanish Empire was in terminal decline. It had lost its American colonies, its navy had been destroyed by the English, and its economy was in bankruptcy. Were still revolutionary, and later, Napoleonic France threatened to swallow the entire Iberian Peninsula. From a very young age, Fernando showed a deeply disturbing personality. He was known for his cowardice, his tendency toward treason, and his inability to maintain any lasting loyalty. Even as Prince of Asturias, he actively conspired against his own father, going so far as to write secret letters to Napoleon Bonaparte asking for support to overthrow Charles IV. This family betrayal would be just the first of many acts that would define his reputation as the felon king. In 1808, when he finally managed to force his father's abdication and took the throne, Fernando lasted barely 2 months as king. Napoleon, who had been manipulating the Spanish royal family like pieces on a chessboard, summoned both father and son to a meeting in Bianque, France. There, in one of the most humiliating episodes in European monarchical history, Fernando voluntarily renounced the Spanish throne in favor of Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, in exchange for a French pension and the promise of a castle in France. While the Spanish people rose up in a bloody 6-year war against the French occupation, their legitimate king lived comfortably as a guest in the castle of Balenci, hosting dinners, playing musical instruments, and flirting with ladies of the French court. This monumental cowardice was seen by the Spanish people as the ultimate betrayal. While guerrilla fighters lived in the mountains, fighting and dying for their homeland, Fernando ate oysters and drank champagne at the table of his captors. During these years of golden exile, the first rumors began to circulate about the king's questionable masculinity. Diplomatic correspondence from the time preserved in French archives made veiled allusions to the Spanish monarch's personal weaknesses. It wasn't just about political cowardice. There were whispers about his physical virility. Some French chroniclers of the time suggested that Fernando might be impotent, which would explain his ease in trading a kingdom for a life of superficial pleasures. When Napoleon was finally defeated in 1814, Fernando returned to Spain, not as a liberating hero, but as a deeply compromised figure. The people, in an impressive display of naivety or desperation, welcomed him as the desired one. This warm reception must have been one of the greatest political misunderstandings in European history, because Fernando immediately proved that his years in France had not changed his fundamental character at all. His first act as restored king was to completely abolish the Constitution of 1812, which had been drafted during his absence by the Cortes of Cádiz and represented the most advanced liberal ideals of the time. Fernando restored brutal absolutism, relentlessly persecuted all liberals who had fought for Spain's independence, and established a reign of terror that would have made even the worst tyrants in history envious. But it was in his personal life that the darkest and most disturbing aspects of Fernando's personality were revealed. He married 4 times, and each marriage was marked by rumors, scandals, and more significantly, the king's apparent inability to produce heirs. His first marriage was to Maria Antonia of Naples in 1802, when he was still prince. Maria Antonia died in 1806 without having had children, and rumors circulated that the marriage had never been consummated. His second marriage, to Isabella Braganza, daughter of the King of Portugal, took place in 1816. Isabel was described as an exceptionally beautiful and intelligent woman, but the couple had no children during the 3 years the marriage lasted before the Queen's premature death once again. It was whispered in the palace hallways that there were intimate problems between the spouses. Fernando's third marriage to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony was even more embarrassing. Maria Josepha was a pragmatic and determined woman who supposedly tried all the known methods of the time to get pregnant. Doctors were consulted, special prayers were held, pilgrimages were organized, but during 7 years of marriage, no heir appeared. The European court began to openly mock the Spanish king's inability to fulfill what was considered the most basic duty of any monarch, ensuring dynastic succession. It was during this period that the rumors about Fernando's masculinity became more specific and cruel. Foreign ambassadors wrote in their diplomatic reports about the king's particular difficulty. Satirical pamphlets circulated secretly through Madrid, joking about the king's lack. Some went so far as to suggest that Fernando may have been born with genital deformities or that some disease had compromised his reproductive capacity. The situation became so embarrassing that when Maria Josepha died in 1829, Fernando, already 45 years old, was practically forced by the royal council to attempt a 4th marriage. The chosen bride was Maria Cristina of Bourbon, 2 Sicilies, his niece, 23 years younger than him. This marriage had a desperate tone. It was the king's last chance to produce an heir and save both his political and personal reputation. Surprisingly, Maria Cristina became pregnant almost immediately. In October 1830, Princess Isabella was born, and 2 years later, Princess Luisa Fernando. Finally, after 3 barren marriages, Fernando had managed to produce offspring. The cruel irony was that after decades of obsession with a male heir, his only children were girls. The birth of the princesses should have silenced the rumors about Fernando's masculinity, but in reality, it had the opposite effect. It was whispered that the girls might not be the king's daughters, but those of some lover of the young queen. Others suggested that Fernando had finally found effective medical treatments, or that special prayers had worked a miracle. The most malicious rumors insinuated that the king might have used artificial methods, a scandalous idea at the time, but one that showed just how far his reputation had deteriorated. During the last years of his reign, Fernando became an increasingly pathetic and hated figure. His health rapidly declined. He suffered from gout, chronic digestive problems, and an obesity that frequently confined him to bed. His always volatile temperament became completely unpredictable. He alternated between deep depression and tyrannical outbursts that terrified the court. The most disturbing aspect of Fernando's final years was his growing obsession with his own masculinity and virility. Medical reports from the time, preserved in the royal archives, indicate that the king constantly consulted his doctors about intimate matters, demanding treatments to improve his sexual performance and ensure more children. He consumed all kinds of supposed aphrodisiac potions and elixirs, from powdered rhinoceros horn extracts of exotic plants imported from the American colonies. This fixation with his virility seemed directly connected to his growing political paranoia. Fernando had always been an insecure king, but in his final years, he developed a morbid obsession with the idea that his enemies questioned not only his political authority, but his fundamental masculinity. He interpreted any criticism of his government as a personal attack on his virility, and responded with brutality that shocked even by the standards of the time. In September 1833, Fernando fell seriously ill. His doctors diagnosed a combination of acute gout, kidney problems, and what would today likely be identified as advanced diabetes. For months, he agonized in a bed in the royal palace, alternating between feverish delirium and terrifyingly lucid moments in which he showed full awareness of his approaching death. It was during this prolonged agony that Fernando made a decision that would become the most memorable aspect of his entire reign. According to later accounts, the king, obsessed until the end with questions of masculinity and succession, had given specific instructions regarding the treatment of his body after death. Some sources suggest that he himself ordered that his genital organ be preserved as a kind of proof of his virility for posterity. When Fernando finally died on September 29, 1833, his body underwent the typical embalming process of the time for royalty. This procedure involved the extraction of internal organs, treatment of the body with preserving substances, and preparation for the state funeral. It was during this process that, according to legend, the episode occurred that would give rise to the most persistent and embarrassing rumor associated with the name of Fernando VII. The exact details vary depending on the source, but the most common version of the story suggests that by express order of the king himself or of someone close to him, Fernando's genital organ was extracted during the embalming and preserved separately in a glass jar filled with alcohol. This jar was supposedly kept in secret in the personal archives of the royal family, supposedly as a kind of relic of royal masculinity. The first documented mention of this story appears in Spanish chronicles from the late 19th century, approximately 60 years after Fernando's death. The historian Benito Pérez Galdós, in his Episodios Nacionales, makes a veiled reference to the curious fate of the mortal remains of the desired one. Other chroniclers of the time, like Ramón de Manzanares Romanos, include similar allusions in their memoirs of Queen Isabella's court. The story gained international traction when the French writer Alexandre Dumas' father, in his travel memoirs through Spain, mentioned having heard rumors about a particular royal relic kept in the Palace of Madrid. Dumas, known for his tendency toward sensationalism, described having been informed by a Spanish noble about the last trophy of the Spanish Bourbon dynasty, clearly referring to the supposed preserved organ. During the 20th century, the legend was perpetuated by various authors and journalists. The writer Gerald Brennan, in his classic The Spanish Labyrinth, mentioned having heard the story during his stay in Spain in the 1920s. American and French journalists visiting Madrid frequently included references to the legend in their reports on the Spanish royal family. What makes this story particularly fascinating is not so much its truth, which is impossible to prove, but what it reveals about the reputation of Fernando VII and about 19th century Spanish society. The fact that this specific legend has persisted for so long, being repeated and embellished through generations, suggests that it captured something fundamental about how Fernando was perceived by his contemporaries and by posterity. The obsession with preserving the dead king's genital organ can be interpreted as the final symbol of a monarchy obsessed with questions of legitimacy and succession, but incapable of addressing the real problems it faced. Fernando VII had spent his entire life fighting against rumors about his masculinity and his ability to produce heirs. The idea that even in death, he would have tried to prove his virility by physically preserving the organ in question has a perverse logic when we consider his personality and obsessions. Furthermore, the legend reflects the attitudes of the time regarding royal masculinity and political power. In a society that saw male reproductive capacity as directly linked to political authority, an impotent or sterile king was not just a personal tragedy, it was a constitutional crisis. The preservation of the royal genital organ would, in this context, be a desperate attempt to retain some vestige of dynastic legitimacy. The story also reveals the cruelty of Spanish popular humor. The Spanish people, who had suffered under Fernando's tyrannical regime, found in the legend of the preserved organ a way to posthumously ridicule a king they had hated in life. The idea that the only part of Fernando considered worthy of preservation would be precisely the one about which so many humiliating rumors had circulated represents a particularly sophisticated form of popular revenge. From a historical point of view, it is important to note that no physical evidence has ever been found of this supposed relic. No official inventory of the Spanish royal archives has ever listed such an object, and not even during the political upheavals of the 20th century, when many royal secrets came to light, did any concrete proof of the existence of the mysterious jar emerge. Researchers who have had access to the archives of the Spanish royal household report never having found any document that confirms the story. Similarly, none of the success of Spanish kings ever made any reference to the supposed relic, something that would be expected if it truly existed, and were considered important for the dynasty. This absence of evidence, however, has not diminished the power of the legend. If anything, the impossibility of definitively proving or refuting the story has only increased its appeal. The legend of Fernando VII's preserved organ has become one of those stories that transcend facts to become part of cultural folklore. During the Spanish Civil War and the subsequent Franco dictatorship, the legend took on new political meanings. Republicans and communists used the story as an example of the monarchy's decadence and ridiculousness. While monarchists tried to suppress or discredit it, Franco himself, obsessed with questions of masculinity and authority, was said to hate any mention of the story and tried to eliminate it from official history books. Ironically, it was during the democratic period after Franco's death that the legend gained new life. Historians and journalists, finally free to explore previously censored aspects of Spanish history, rediscovered and popularized the story. Popular history books, TV programs, and even films made references to the legend, ensuring it would continue to be part of Spanish cultural consciousness. The persistence of this particular story, it also reflects changes in social attitudes towards sexuality and power in the 21st century. The idea of a king obsessed with his virility to the point of preserving his genital organ after death does not just seem strange, it seems deeply pathological. This change in perspective has transformed Fernando VII from a possibly tragic figure into a genuinely grotesque one. From a psychological point of view, the legend offers fascinating insights into the nature of absolute power and its distortion. Fernando VII exemplifies what happens when someone with unlimited power develops personal obsessions. Those obsessions inevitably become matters of state. His fixation on his own masculinity was not just a personal neurosis, it was something that affected Spain's domestic and foreign policy. The comparison with other European monarchs of the time is revealing. Louis XI of France, a contemporary of Fernando, also faced rumors about his sexuality and his ability to have children, but he managed to maintain his royal dignity and never became the subject of such humiliating legends. The difference may lie in the fact that Luigi Woodiftones, despite his limitations, was respected for his intelligence and political skill, while Fernando was universally despised for his cowardice and betrayal. The story of the supposed preserved organ also illustrates how 19th-century European monarchies were struggling against social and political changes that were rendering many of their traditions and justifications for power obsolete. Fernando's obsession with proving his physical masculinity reflected an instinctive understanding that royal authority was being questioned at fundamental levels. In terms of historical legacy, the legend achieved something that none of his actual policies ever did. It made Fernando VII truly memorable. While his administrative reforms, military decisions, and economic policies are known only to specialists, the story of his supposed preserved organ is known to anyone with a casual interest in Spanish history. This final irony that a king who spent his life obsessed with his reputation and legacy ended up being remembered mainly for a humiliating legend about his genitals represents perhaps the cruelest revenge that history could have exercised on Fernando VII. He wanted to be remembered as a great absolute monarch. Instead, he is remembered as the king whose sexual organ was supposedly preserved in a jar. The legend also serves as a grim reminder about the fragility of royal dignity and how quickly a reputation can turn into ridicule. Fernando VII died believing he had restored Spanish absolutism and guaranteed the future of the Bourbon dynasty. In reality, his daughter Isabel Averin would be overthrown by a revolution barely 35 years later, and the Spanish monarchy would face existential crises throughout the 20th century. Today, nearly 2 centuries after the death of Fernando VII, the story of his supposed preserved organ continues to circulate on the internet, in popular documentaries, and in alternative history books. It has become a permanent part of European royal mythology, alongside other legends like the alleged hemophilia of the Romanovs, the madness of George III of England. Whether the story of Fernando VII preserved organ is fact or not will probably never be known. The Spanish royal archives keep their secrets, and many documents were lost or destroyed during the political turmoil of the 19th and 20th centuries. But perhaps the factual truth is less important than the symbolic truth that the legend represents. The story of the king with the most controversial member in Europe is fundamentally a parable about power, masculinity, and the futility of human vanity. Fernando VII dedicated his life to trying to prove his virility and authority, only to become an object of ridicule to posterity. If his organ was indeed preserved in a jar, it would be merely the final physical symbol of a life wasted on empty obsessions and unnecessary cruelties. In the end, the legend of Fernando VII reminds us that history has a cruel way of humiliating those who care most about their own greatness. The king, who feared ridicule for his lack of masculinity, became exactly that. Not because he was preserved in a jar, but because his personality and actions revealed a poverty of spirit that no physical display of virility could ever mask. History can never be embalmed. It always finds a way to reveal the truth about those who try to control it.